Hey everyone, I'm trying a little something different for this video. Longer form, getting into the weeds with what I think is one of the landmark, seminal, however you want to describe it, a study to know within the world of psilocybin therapy. The title of the study is Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance. So the study was published back in 2006, but I actually didn't become aware of it until 2018, so 12 years later. And that's sort of the nature of scientific advancement. It takes decades to update the rest of the scientific community and then, let alone the general public at large about these kinds of advances. And what was so groundbreaking about this study was it was basically substantiating what those who have experienced mushrooms, mostly in the underground, have known for decades, and then also what indigenous lineages have known for millennia, possibly longer. We don't really know. So in a world where a lot of us worship at the altar of the Church of Science, I just think it is really cool that science is validating what these healing lineages and medicine people have understood for a long time. And it's really important, I think, in today's society that when we have our leading medical research institutions and our leading most prestigious medical journals publishing this type of research, it really starts to move the needle on rescheduling, reclassifying these medicines. I'm talking about psychedelic medicines in general, but for now, we'll just stick to psilocybin as part of the discussion. But my intention with this channel is to help spread awareness and education and to really help legitimize these medicines. I think there's still so much misconception, misunderstanding, and judgment about these medicines. I think a lot of that damage was done because of the abuse of mushrooms, which really are a potent medicine. Like anything, they can be abused. And when they are abused, I think that reflects really badly and is a disservice for those who are using them for healing purposes. We're going to look at this study out of the legendary Johns Hopkins University, out of the lab of the late Roland Griffiths. Rest in peace, he passed away recently, and he's destined to become a true legend in what has become the psychedelic science renaissance. And it was this study that really, I think, kicked off the real explosion of studies, at least in the United States. There were some really interesting studies already starting to occur in Europe in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. But Roland Griffiths really was a pioneer in so many ways. So the question that the researchers were asking in this study was basically, they probably were well aware anecdotally that mushrooms can lead to some really interesting mystical type experiences. There's actually wonderful historical documentation of their use across cultures, across time. And so now in the modern era, they were looking to study that with the scientific method. Roland Griffiths was a pharmacologist, and he really took a pharmacologist approach to this study, which I think is great. But he also wove in some psychology and maybe even theology you could think of in terms of looking at the measurements that they looked at. Let's look at the study design. There were 36 healthy volunteers in total. 30 of the volunteers were in one experimental group and 6 were in another. Let's look at this first group of 30. This group was randomized to either receive psilocybin and then methylphenidate or vice versa. This is what's called a crossover design. So in the first session, the first group received psilocybin while the other group received the methylphenidate, which served as the placebo control. After a certain period, in this case it was a 2-month interval, the treatments were switched or crossed over. So the group that initially received psilocybin then received methylphenidate, and the ones that received methylphenidate first then received psilocybin. And outcomes are measured before and after each treatment session. And the main benefit of a crossover design is that it allows for within subject comparison. So people basically act as their own control because there can be interparticipant differences, and researchers would like to control for that. So let's talk about double blind. This means that neither the volunteers nor the monitors or we would call them facilitators, the people who are helping to facilitate the sessions or monitor the sessions, neither party knew what was being given in each session. So it was double blind. Now let's look at the placebo control. The placebo chosen in this case was not just an inert sugar pill. It was an active placebo. The reason why they chose an active placebo is to help try to control for expectancy effects or to help with the blinding of the study. Because if you take a consciousness altering substance, it's pretty easy to know right away whether or not you've taken something, especially something that alters the way that you perceive reality. You can very quickly discern like, oh, I didn't get the placebo, I got the psilocybin. And because of that, it can create what's called expectancy effects. And so people can start to expect that the journey will go one way based on what they've heard about. In this case, they were told that they could be given psilocybin and they're educated about psilocybin and its effects, but they also were told that they could receive what ended up being the active placebo control in this case, which the one chosen was methylphenidate, which is also known as Ritalin, or one of any number of other substances they said it could be that they were receiving. So they really tried hard to maintain the blinded nature of the study for the participants and the monitors. Why did they choose methylphenidate? It was because it has a similar onset and duration of effects as psilocybin, and also some overlap in the subjective effects. They noted excitability, nervousness, and increased positive mood. So further trying to obscure whether or not the participants received psilocybin or the control. So now let's talk about this other group of 6 additional volunteers. They received methylphenidate in the first 2 sessions and then an unblinded psilocybin for their 3rd session. And the reason for this group was to further obscure the study design for the monitors and the participants, which I thought was really interesting. Now, a little bit of history to help flesh out the next part of this study design. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the studies that were done with psilocybin and other psychedelics, it became obvious after those studies that set and setting play a substantially larger role in the experience of these substances compared to other substances. And set is sort of short form for mindset. We now know today that the mindset that one has when going into these experiences and then the setting, the actual environment that they take these medicines within have a outsized influence on the experience and on the benefits afterwards, or the harms, the adverse effects. And so the researchers took great care to properly prepare the participants before they sat for their administration sessions. And so there were 4 2-hour sessions for a total of 8 hours before the first administration session. And then there were 4 1-hour sessions after that administration session. Then there was the second administration, then another 4 1-hour sessions after. And so encouraging people who are going to sit with psilocybin in a therapeutic context to perform like a life review and to really set your intentions when sitting. And then in terms of the setting, they really took care to have the sessions occur not in a clinical setting with exam tables and fluorescent lights, and that would be horrific, but it was an aesthetic living room situation. And so I kind of laughed at that. Now let's look at the dose, because I think that's interesting to take note of too. The dose that was given was 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms, which is such a pharmacologist approach to doling out mushrooms. So let's break this down a little bit though, because I do think it's helpful for informing dosing, which is a really big question now in the psilocybin facilitation space. So 30 milligrams of psilocybin analyte, or the actual molecule of psilocybin, is not the whole dried mushroom. The whole dried mushroom has anywhere between 4 to 12 milligrams of psilocybin analyte per gram of whole dried mushroom. And a hero's dose of mushrooms, anecdotally, colloquially, is roughly 3 to 5 grams of whole dried mushroom. So if we take take, say, an average of 8 milligrams of psilocybin per gram of whole dried mushroom, we're looking at roughly 3.5 grams of whole dried mushroom is what was given to these participants. So decent dose of psilocybin, especially for those who've never had psilocybin before. And during the sessions themselves, they were encouraged to wear an eye mask to really diminish any visual stimulation to help encourage the participants to go inward. They were given headphones, and then a classical music playlist was played through the headphones. And the facilitators didn't really interact with the participants at all unless they were having an experience of fear or anxiety or something like that, in which case they just reached out with a hand for some supportive touch on a shoulder or in the participant's hand. Okay, let's look at the participants. The participants were roughly half male and half female. I think it was 14 male and 12 were female. None had the history of any hallucinogen use, no family history of schizophrenia, bipolar 1 or 2, or other psychotic disorder. They were 24 to 64 years old. They were well educated. 97% were college graduates and 56% had postgraduate degrees. All were employed, 83% of them full-time. 19 of the participants were affiliated with a religious or spiritual community, whether it was church, a synagogue, meditation group, and all of the participants were at least intermittently affiliated. They were busy professionals, but they made participation priority, and they were mostly motivated by curiosity and the opportunity for extensive self-reflection. Oh, I forgot to mention that in the study design is that for the participants, they collected heart rate and blood pressure measurements throughout the sessions as well. Okay, so let's look at the key findings from this study. And I sort of break up the key findings into categories. One category is looking at the mystical or spiritual experience and the positive psychological benefits from those experiences. And then just looking at the safety profile of psilocybin. Is it safe from a physiological standpoint? Is it safe from a psychological standpoint? So looking at the participants when they received the psilocybin versus the methylphenidate, the sessions where they had the psilocybin, they reported strong mystical and spiritual experiences, which were characterized by a sense of unity, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, and difficulty putting the experience into words, which is known as ineffability. 61% met criteria for a complete mystical experience, which was measured by these various questionnaires, all of which are established and empirically derived criteria, which capture dimensions of mystical experiences that scholars of mysticism have defined as being central to these experiences. And then looking 2 months later after the psilocybin experience, participants rated that experience as having great personal meaning and spiritual significance, with 67% rating it as one of the top 5 most meaningful experience of their life, up there with a birth of a child or the death of a parent. They also reported positive changes in attitude, mood, and behavior, and this was confirmed by their friends and family. There also was a significant increase in well-being and life satisfaction, with 79% of participants reporting moderately or greatly increased sense of well-being and life satisfaction after the psilocybin sessions. So is psilocybin safe? And I think based on this study's results, we can cautiously conclude, and this was later confirmed by other studies, that psilocybin is remarkably safe. No serious adverse effects occurred other than transient anxiety or dysphoria in 8 of the participants in the psilocybin session, all of which resolved with reassurance from the monitors, and it was completely gone by the end of the session. And at the 12-month follow-up, there were no reports of persisting perceptual phenomena, sometimes attributed to recreational abuse of hallucinogens, and all participants appeared to continue to be high-functioning, productive members of society. And there was actually another study, which I'll review, that published the 12-month results of this study. Psilocybin is also physiologically safe. The heart rate increased by about 10 beats per minute on average for both the psilocybin and methylphenidate, and remained elevated over baseline throughout the session, but then safely returned back to baseline. And blood pressure was also elevated throughout the session, on average about 20 millimeters of mercury. There's also always this question of addiction or abuse of psilocybin and other psychedelics. They did address this in the discussion in the study, and I think it's important to address it here, that psilocybin doesn't produce the compulsive drug-seeking behavior like classic addicting drugs, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin, the drug self-administration in animal lab models of drug abuse. The classic one is the rat with the cocaine little lever, and the rat just keeps administering cocaine to itself until it dies. You don't see this behavior with psilocybin and other psychedelics in the animal models. And in this current study that we're discussing with humans, they note that psilocybin did not produce the classic, what's called euphorogenic profile of effects. So meaning the classic unbounded euphoria during the experience, because of the not insignificant level of anxiety or dysphoria that you can experience on psilocybin and other psychedelics that come along with the high. It leads to less abuse. The way I characterize it is that you get the full spectrum of feelings and emotions and experiences with psilocybin. And that is incredibly therapeutic for a lot of people. And even though one can have incredibly meaningful experiences and insights with psilocybin, because it's a real inner work that one is doing with it, you're not eager to turn around and be like, yeah, let's do that again the next day. There's a lot to process, a lot to integrate. And because of that, it's just not this compulsive addiction behavior. And I also like to note too that psilocybin is primarily a serotonergic substance, or a substance that works, we think so far based on other studies, it functions mostly through serotonin receptors and in a different pathway than the other drugs of abuse. The other drugs of abuse, a lot of them work through the mesolimbic reward system, which is a dopamine receptor based system, like dopaminergic is what we say. And so this is like not quite fair to characterize psilocybin as a drug in that way, a drug of abuse at least. So as with any journal article or review, I think to round it out, it's nice to talk about the weaknesses and the strengths of the study. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses. It is a small and homogeneous sample, which leads to questions of generalizability. So it's this sample of volunteers, they skewed really well educated, already really high functioning, and they really had a strong already religious or spiritual practice as a group. All of them were at least intermittently affiliated in some way. And so I think it's important just to note that when you're thinking about this potentially for yourself, would you put that yourself in that category or not? And so then it leads to questions of, could we take the results of this study and generalize or apply them to the greater population? There's the potential confounding effects of the psychological support. And so because everyone received psychological support, it's hard to separate out whether the psychological support itself really lended a lot to the meaningfulness of these experiences. So separating out those effects is a question. And then this is always, I think, the critique for any psilocybin study, which is possible expectancy effects. So the volunteers were told that psilocybin can induce a mystical type or spiritual experience. And so the question is, does that prime someone to have that kind of experience? All that being said, I think this is a really rigorous study of psilocybin. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled design, crossover design. They had rigorous screening and preparation of the participants and standardized measures. I love that they also surveyed their friends and family to see what the changes were in their loved ones. And also, it really was groundbreaking in the findings, and that this was the first study study of its kind to scientifically back up the power of psilocybin, which paved the way for all the further research to come down the pike for the therapeutic potential of psilocybin. So if you made it this far, wow, amazing. You're really curious about psilocybin and its therapeutic potential. I'll be reviewing a few more studies. So if you derived any sort of value or benefit, I would love if you supported the channel by hitting like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.